What you're about to hear is a speculative geopolitical scenario, a hypothetical future analysis based on real-world energy dynamics, regional tensions, and publicly known vulnerabilities. This is not a news report. It is a strategic simulation of what could happen if a major conflict were to close the Strait of Hormuz. Names of real companies and leaders are used for analytical context only. No statements are confirmed or official. This is Strategic Dynamics Edge, and this is how a worst-case scenario for global energy could unfold. Right now, imagine 600 ships sitting completely still in the waters around the Persian Gulf. Not moving, not delivering, not earning. 600 tankers, cargo vessels, and oil ships, some trapped inside the strait, some locked outside it, going absolutely nowhere. And in this scenario, the man running the world's most powerful oil company has just told global markets that if this situation does not change by mid-June, the entire global oil market will not recover until the year 2027. That is not a headline. That is a warning. And it should concern every single one of you, whether you fill up your car, fly on a plane, pay an electricity bill, or simply buy groceries. Welcome to Strategic Dynamics Edge, where we break down the forces shaping our world before most people even realize what is happening. If you're new here, subscribe right now and ring that bell, because what we are about to cover in the next 10 minutes is exactly the kind of strategic picture the mainstream media is not fully drawing for you. Stay with me through this entire video, because the second half is where the most important analysis lives. Now, before we go any further, a clear disclaimer. Everything in this video is speculative scenario analysis. This is a hypothetical future projection built from real-world geopolitical risk factors, publicly available energy data, and documented regional vulnerabilities. It is not a report of confirmed events. It is a strategic simulation of a plausible worst-case future. We use real companies, real geography, and real historical patterns to make this analysis credible and educational, not to suggest these events have occurred. With that fully established, let us build this scenario together. The Strait of Hormuz. If you have heard that name before and wondered why analysts keep flagging it as the single most dangerous choke point on Earth, here is the answer in one sentence. Roughly 1/5 of all the oil that moves across the entire world passes through that narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. That is it. That is the vulnerability. And in this hypothetical scenario, it is effectively closed. In this projected 2026 conflict simulation, a breakdown between the United States and Iran sends shockwaves through the global energy system almost immediately. Within days, tanker traffic through Hormuz collapses. And what follows is what, in this scenario, the CEO of Saudi Aramco describes as the biggest crisis the region's energy sector has ever faced. Those would not be the words of a journalist. They would be the words of the man running the company that produces more oil than almost any nation on Earth. So let us ask, what does the math actually look like if this plays out? In this scenario, more than 14 million barrels of oil per day are shut in. They are sitting in the ground or in storage, unable to reach the global market. The total simulated supply loss since the start of the conflict exceeds 1 billion barrels. In just 60 days, March and April of this hypothetical timeline, the world draws down 250 million barrels from its emergency reserves. Those reserves exist specifically for moments like this. They are the cushion between a disruption and a catastrophe. And in this scenario, that cushion gets thinner every single day. Energy economists modeling the situation would reach for words like unprecedented and without parallel in modern times. Because historically, no single event has produced a supply shock of this scale and duration simultaneously across every major Gulf producer. Now let us talk about Saudi Arabia in this scenario specifically, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely complex. The kingdom is not simply watching from the sidelines. It is simultaneously a victim of the crisis, a manager of it, and in some ways, because of the record premium prices it can now charge for the oil that still gets out, a country earning more per barrel than ever before in its history. In this simulation, an Iranian drone attack strikes the Ras Tanura refinery, the largest refinery in Saudi Arabia. The main wave of drones is intercepted by air defenses, but debris causes a fire. And out of basic operational safety, the facility shuts down. Saudi propane and butane exports stop for weeks, not because the refinery is destroyed, it is not, but because no safety officer in the world keeps an oil refinery running while hostile drones are in the airspace above it. The simulated attacks continue. Iran launches 20 drones in 5 separate waves toward the Sheba oil field, deep in the empty quarter desert, a facility so remote that before any such conflict, most analysts assumed it was effectively untouchable. Saudi air defenses in this scenario intercept all 20. But the message to the market is unmistakable. If Iran had the targeting coordinates for Sheba, there is no Saudi oil infrastructure, no matter how far inland or how heavily defended, that would not be at risk. In this projection, Saudi Arabia's overall production capacity is reduced by roughly 600,000 barrels per day. not because of quota decisions or sanctions, but because of direct hits on infrastructure. That number alone would represent the most significant production disruption in the kingdom's modern history. Saudi Arabia in this scenario does have a backup plan. The East-West pipeline, which runs overland from the Gulf Coast to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, completely bypasses Hormuz. In this simulation, Saudi Arabia activates it almost immediately, scaling throughput from 800,000 barrels per day to 5 million barrels per day in just 6 weeks. That is a remarkable operational achievement. But then, in this scenario, Yanbu gets targeted too. It is not destroyed. Repair teams restart operations within 72 hours. But the analytical point is significant. Every major Saudi export node has now been struck at least once. The backup to the backup has been found and hit. And that changes the long-term security calculation for every energy infrastructure investment in the region. Meanwhile, the tanker fleet situation in this scenario becomes what maritime analysts would call a structural crisis, rather than a temporary disruption. 600 ships in the wrong places. Ships that should be in the Gulf are sitting outside it. Ships that should be delivering to Asia are stranded in the Red Sea. Cargo worth billions of dollars is going nowhere. And reconstructing the logical geography of the global tanker fleet, getting the right ships to the right ports to move the right cargo, takes time. Enormous amounts of time. Time the market does not have as summer demand approaches. If you are finding this strategic breakdown useful, take 2 seconds and drop a comment below. Tell me, do you think a real-world Hormuz closure scenario is being taken seriously enough by governments? It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it tells me what you want to dig into next. Share this video with someone who follows energy markets or geopolitics. Most people have no mental model for how connected all of these pressure points actually are. Now let us look at what this kind of scenario does to the aviation sector, because this is where the impact moves from geopolitical abstraction to something ordinary people feel directly. In this simulation, airlines across Europe and the United States begin cutting flights as jet fuel costs climb toward historic highs. Major carriers remove tens of thousands of flights from their summer schedules. Governments introduce emergency measures to prevent airlines from losing airport slots, while they ground planes to conserve fuel. Even the national carrier of a major Gulf oil-producing country, in this scenario, cancels flights, because jet fuel, refined from the crude sitting in that country's own fields, has become too expensive or too scarce to sustain full operations. Think about what that means analytically. The country producing the oil cannot fully afford the fuel derived from that oil because the infrastructure connecting production to consumption has been fractured. And Qatar, in this scenario, faces a separate and arguably more severe long-term problem. The Ras Laffan LNG terminal, the largest liquefied natural gas facility on Earth, sustains damage so extensive that analysts project a 17% capacity loss that could take up to 5 years to fully repair. 5 years, not 5 weeks, not 5 months. The 2019 Abqaiq attack on Saudi Arabia, at the time described as the largest oil supply disruption in history, was repaired in weeks. Nothing in the modern history of energy infrastructure has produced a 5-year repair timeline at this scale. If this scenario were to materialize, the world's LNG supply architecture would be altered in ways that affect European heating costs, Japanese electricity prices, and Asian industrial output for years beyond the immediate crisis. Here is the timeline threshold that every energy professional in this scenario is watching. If Hormuz reopens quickly, the oil market could rebalance within a few months. But if it remains restricted past the middle of June, roughly 2 to 3 weeks into this projected timeline, then the combination of tanker fleet dislocation, infrastructure damage, accelerating inventory drawdown, and peak summer demand creates a situation where normalization in the same calendar year becomes mathematically impossible. The market would not recover until the following year. Mid-June is not a political deadline in this analysis. It is a physical and commercial threshold. Cross it with the strait still closed and the global oil system loses another year. In this scenario, the ceasefire brokered by a regional mediator, the one that oil markets briefly rallied on, collapses under the weight of rejected counterproposals and competing ultimatums. The gap between what each side demands and what the other will accept does not close. The strait remains closed, the tankers sit, the inventories draw, and the clock runs toward the threshold that makes the later normalization timeline the baseline case. Diplomatic communications in this simulation produce the pattern that has defined the conflict's entire diplomatic track. Temporary hope, followed by renewed deadlock, cycling repeatedly without resolution. Saudi Arabia in this scenario does everything within its power. It activates the pipeline. It reroutes exports. It maintains its dividend. It posts strong quarterly earnings despite a significant working capital build, which is the balance sheet expression of what happens when oil is produced but cannot be fully delivered because the routes are compromised. By every measure that the company can control, it performs with remarkable resilience. But the Strait of Hormuz is not something any company or kingdom can unilaterally reopen. The 600 ships in the wrong places cannot be unscrambled by operational flexibility alone. The deeper analytical point is this: the world built its entire energy security architecture on one foundational assumption, that Middle Eastern disruptions would always be localized. A revolution here, a conflict there, something that disrupts one country's output while the rest of the system absorbs and adjusts. This scenario breaks that assumption entirely. It strikes the export infrastructure of every major Gulf producer simultaneously. It damages all three primary alternative export routes simultaneously. It strands 600 ships simultaneously, and it does so in a way that neutralizes the spare production capacity that was specifically designed to cushion the world against exactly this kind of shock, because that spare capacity sits behind the closed strait. The world's energy insurance policy is trapped behind the very risk it was designed to manage. That is the trap within the trap. And that is why this scenario, if it were ever to materialize, would be categorically different from every previous energy crisis in modern history. The water is not moving, the clock is running. And the question that no diplomatic announcement in this simulation has yet answered, when does the strait reopen, is the only question that actually matters. Because until it does, every barrel the world needs and cannot get, every tanker sitting idle in the wrong ocean, every flight that gets canceled, every energy bill that climbs higher, every reserve drawn down one more day, all of it points toward a normalization timeline that the world is simply not prepared for. This is strategic dynamics edge. If this scenario analysis gave you a sharper picture of why the Strait of Hormuz matters more than most people realize, then subscribe, because this depth of strategic thinking is exactly what this channel is built for. Hit the like button, it directly helps more people find this content, and leave a comment with your take. Do you think governments are seriously preparing for a Hormuz closure scenario, or is this a risk that is being underestimated? Share this video, because the more people who understand these dynamics, the better equipped we all are to make sense of what is happening in the world. I will see you in the next one.